is the tax it imposes on its citizens. Señorag is the way it collects money to pay for this. But why should it pay? I mean, why should profits, I mean, just to put it in, what you were saying last night, why should profits be privatized and all the rest be socialized? I mean, why should people, these are not my words, I mean, I heard it from Ruben and, some journalists have been talking about it. But that's the situation. You have to ask yourself a question. That right in front of you, the government needs all the industrialists, wants to meet every entrepreneur to minimize a situation like that. But where will this money come? Of course, if I'm an entrepreneur, I get a freebie, that's great. But it comes at a cost. And I think that's where the 800 million people begin to lose out. It's interesting. Statistics is an amazing way in which we can present a view whichever way we like it to. So let me tell you a bit of a story about how poverty can be reduced in this country. Imagine we have 50% people living on 50 cents a day and 50% poor people living on $1 a day. I take 1 cent from a 50-cent guy and give it to $1. I've reduced poverty by 50%. Does that make sense? I mean, have we really reduced poverty? This is what is happening in terms of redistributing resources. I mean, how many people participate in the stock market? The number of people who participate in chit funds is twice as high as the number of mutual funds account owners in Andhra Pradesh. But when you look at the chit fund industry, the government is going all out to go and tax them. But why? I think the mindset, we have to be very careful of what we want. At one end, yes, we want freebies, but it comes at a price. We'll have to pay a huge price as a common man and as a country which is slowly getting divided. So that is the question that entrepreneurs has to ask in terms of the opportunity and the challenge. Can we rise to the occasion and beyond our selfish interests? Really, think about, as entrepreneurs, where this country is headed. And these things are hidden. So that's
sure. This sort of goes to an interesting point that I consistently make, which is that one of the things that people never point to is that there is only one country that has ever industrialized by guaranteeing every person the vote, and that is India. No other country has. You can go through history. You can go to the United States, Germany, whatever. They were all, in varying forms, the vote was not present. So in a large extent, do you think that there is for whatever word, is there a democracy tax, so to speak? And how do you think of, say, an issue like that? That there is. Do you want to jump in?
I think that's a fair point. There is a democracy tax, and we say, oh, in China they want to build a new town, they just move 1,000 people there and they build roads. And the question is, that's great as long as it's somebody else in somebody else's town. But what if they're coming to your home and moving yours? So I think we recognize that the growth path that we have taken is different from most other countries.
Sure.
It is clearly slower. I think, however, over the long term, it's probably more balanced. Right? Because at the end of the day, come 2010, 2011, things in China are going to slow down. There's only so much steel the world needs. You cannot keep making steel the way you have in cement, and they're going to hit a wall. Now the challenge is that imbalance is going to roll over to countries like India. So I think, we do pay a democracy tax, and, I guess the ones who do pay taxes don't mind.
Sure. Anyone else want to jump in?
I think democracy is a tax worth paying. I quite frankly would want to be in India any day with all its imperfections. It gives me an opportunity, in the sense, to be talking about these issues without actually being jailed, quite frankly. And that's a freedom I love, I want that freedom, But, I think, it gives me an opportunity to sit among people. We have venture capitalists, we have a fund manager, we have a development person, to discuss and deliberate issues we're trying to find a common ground. I think Atanu said it very rightly that the government should not only expect it from the private sector. I think there's a great deal of partnership that needs to be done, and that can only happen in a democratic setup. In a non-democratic setup, there will always be diktats, and I don't think anybody can achieve any development that we want to achieve. We are a large country. A 1 billion people democracy, it's not trivial. We are almost 3 to 4 times as large as, or maybe twice as large as America is. And Ruben's point about democracy, the process of industrialization. In fact, we proved to the world that we've taken a totally different path of development. We bypassed industrialization, if you ask me. We are in the service sector. But I think what is great about it is, imagine in this event we are talking about 800 million people, where they could be talking about outsourcing, jobs, engineers, no, nothing doing. I think that's democracy and that's a tax worth paying. I mean, think of this panel as a tax on your conference, I mean, you're attending this panel. But I think because you're interested in these set of issues, that's why I'm willing to pay a tax, willing to discuss and deliberate.
May I? I'm not very sure that I quite understand what the great thing about democracy is, but I'm not going to go there right now. But I'd like to point out one thing, that if you notice how people behave, what is it that they value? Political freedom, economic freedom, personal freedom? I don't think political freedom is a very high item on most people's agenda. Think about it this way. When I went to the US, I got a greater degree of economic freedom. I didn't have any political freedom in some sense. I couldn't vote. And I think a very large number of people from any country to migrating to a richer country actually lose their political freedom in some sense, but still they go. Many people will be ready to go and live in Singapore. They'll have very little in terms of political freedom, but they do that. So they're voting with their feet. So what I'm trying to say here is that a great deal is made about the fact that people can vote. But at the end of the day, they don't really care so much about the vote as the economic freedom that they have. So, and we can sit here because we have the economic freedom that we want the political freedom. But if I were to give you a choice that you can have a vote or you can have food, which one would you go for? I have a feeling that most people will go for the food bit before they go for a vote bit.
Right. Just quickly, sort of moving on, just to talk about the role of the private sector versus the public sector, and also about public goods versus private goods. I mean, part of the regulatory setup is a lot of regulations are set up based on the idea that certain things are public goods. Now, for instance, the assumption is that education is a public good, and healthcare is a public good, and so on. Now, is that really the case? I mean, especially in, say, education, there's been enough evidence that's coming out now to suggest that, in fact, the private sector is perfectly capable of delivering high-quality education, primary education even, at fairly reasonable, prices. So that's one part of it. Now, so the sort of follow-up question for that is, if education is not a public good, then what is a public good? I mean, so what can the private sector provide and what cannot the private sector provide?
I'd like to just clarify the words. Are we talking of the public good, or are we talking of public goods? Because the public goods is an economic term, whereas the public good is like is something that is good in general. So
no, I'm talking about non-rival rights.
Okay, so education. Yeah. See, education definitely has public good characteristics, in the sense that it does have externalities, positive externalities, and therefore society does have an interest in providing education, or at least funding the subsidizing part of the education in some cases.
Yeah, I think private sector and investment business is quite capable of what Ajit talked about, funding the Sattvic companies. The question becomes, are there these sectors and industries which capital can go in and capital can come out and great businesses be created, right? If you say education is a problem in 800 million people, and you need to create a school chain nationally with 600 rupees per month, the private sector is capable of doing it, and capital is going to come and management talent can be attracted. So the question becomes, that's where the public policy comes in. Like, is that what India is ready to do, and is there a level playing field to build these kind of businesses?
No, my point is, I don't think enough thought has been given to it, right? Because there are certain things that the private sector can actually provide, as opposed to certain other things. So law and order is not something that the private sector can provide.
Yeah.
The judiciary is not something that the private sector can provide.
You know, public policy needs to provide a level playing field and certain elements of, like, you know, property rights and things like that, where, like, you know, people can play in an economic system. So that, if you categorize as a public good, I'm not an economist, like, you know, those three doctors and then us two sitting here, so I don't know all the terms, but to me, I think if there could be, if you categorize public good as, like, you know, providing a level playing field out there with a strong legal system, so that, like, if I'm investing in my property, I know that, like, hey, nobody else takes over. Things like that are available. Then, like, market-based solutions can solve a lot of problems India has.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think we have a great example of what was erstwhile a public good, which is telecommunications, you know, which was completely taken over by the private sector. And if you look at the growth patterns, both in telecom and media, you know, I think we fundamentally have an example of something that was fairly capital intensive, but yet continues to deliver 40+% EBITDA returns to guys like Airtel at 100 rupee ARPU a month. Now, you know, candidly, the mobile phone has become a public good, and it's good for the public as well, because I think there's very few homes, there's at least 200 million now that have one. So I think there are folks like us would love to get into the education sector. We would love to get into the healthcare sector. The tragedy is that, you know, it's supposed to be a non-profit. So until the regulations, as you were saying, sort of are amended such that we don't have to create structures to artificially manipulate taking profit out of an education business, until then no meaningful investor is going to look at it.
So, I think, you know, just to put things in perspective, I think the biggest challenge we face when it comes to education and the private sector is that, you know, when it comes to thinking about 800 million people, we become very sympathetic towards them that, look, we must provide services without charging them anything for it. And those 800 million constantly tell us, charge us something, but give us something which is good. That's what they're telling us. But the government, you know, in all its sympathies, you know, and very right-minded regulators think, how can you charge? Whether it is regarding interest rates, whether it is regarding, you know, public good like education. Education should be a fundamental right. But still, it's a right which rests with the citizens. I mean, they should be able to decide which school they want to send their children to. They must have those choices. Now, the government forgets that actually they can provide those choices by easing the regulation, which is what I think my investor friends are talking about. But it's our mindset, you know, the 200 million people who actually run the government, it become extremely charitable towards these views. No, no, no. We must not charge for education. The poor people will not pay. We must not charge for hospitalization. They will not pay. What do we have? We have no schools. We have no hospital facilities. That is okay. But charging them is a sin. That, I think, is the mindset change. We 200 million people will have to tell the government that that's not acceptable.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Two other issues that I wanted to touch on. I mean, first one is agriculture. I mean, you know, agriculture is about, in terms of GDP composition, is about 17% of the economy, but employs 60% of labor. Now, if you just look at historical, you know, numbers from the industrialized world, typically what happens is, as productivity in agriculture goes up, you have surplus labor being released, and historically, surplus labor is absorbed into manufacturing. Now, that